I'm Dave Laird.
I'm Matt Booker.
And I'm Allard and Dulk, live from a taxi on its way to the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, Texas. And I will ask the driver to step on it. And you're listening to The Great Concavity.
Yes, nice, Allard. Thank you for your great intro. Welcome to episode 33, everybody. We're here with Allard and Dulk, who is an academic scholar who studies Wallace and literature and film from the University of UV Amsterdam. Is that right?
Well, I'm a research fellow with the VU University Amsterdam, and I'm a lecturer in philosophy, literature, and film at Amsterdam University College. Yeah, sorry.
All right, nice, nailed it. And like you mentioned, Allard, you're currently in Austin, Texas, for a couple months on a Ransom Center fellowship.
Yeah.
That's got to be pretty exciting.
That is pretty sweet. Yeah, no, it is very
No
nice.
kidding.
Yeah.
And this is the second time that I've been lucky enough to record one of these with someone in the same room. Besides in Austin, I should say, we did have one. Dave and I have only recorded once in the same room, and that was this summer in Illinois. So it's great to have you here in Austin. I'm really lucky that I was able to come down here. You're staying very near the university. I live pretty far away from the university. Austin, I was complaining to you earlier, is really spread out. So it's kind of a pain in the butt sometimes for me to even get this far south. Austin traffic is just terrible. A lot of people don't realize Austin is the 11th largest city in America, and I think we have about the third or fourth worst traffic because it was not designed for this many people. So thank you for opening up your place and letting us record here today. It's very exciting.
Yeah, it's a pleasure having you here and to hear the embodied voice of Matt Booker
instead of the disembodied voice.
Exactly.
Right? Yes. It's very strange to meet people who do podcasts you've listened to and then see that the voice is attached to a human mouth and body and all the other things.
I don't really even like thinking about it, to be honest with you. Allard is also the author of a book. Dave, you want to give us the title of the book?
Yes, it is called Existentialist Engagement in Wallace, Eggers, and Foer. It is out on Bloomsbury Press. The subtitle is A Philosophical Analysis of Contemporary American Literature. It came out in 2015. So Bloomsbury, being the generous publisher that they are, sent us copies, and so Matt and I have got to spend some time with your book over the last several months on and off as we've been gearing up for this interview. So thank you for your work there. And Allard, you and I got to meet in Paris a few years ago in 2014 at the gorgeous Sorbonne Wallace conference that had champagne and hors d'oeuvres and, only cost €5. And then whenever I talk about you, I mentioned that on the very last night when everyone went out for the big formal dinner, you showed up a little bit fashionably late, I think maybe on purpose, wearing the bandana, the David Foster Wallace conference bandana that we got as like the conference swag, and everyone just lost their minds laughing. It's just perfectly placed to the right audience at the right time.
I mean, as far as I recall, nobody wore it during any of the panels, and I thought this is such a missed opportunity. At least somebody should wear it. At some sort of conference occasion.
Hell yeah. Yeah. I would have done it.
You nailed it.
So we're going to talk about the book. I definitely want to go through just some basics of the book because I found it really fascinating to read the book, and I think more people should read it and talk about it. So we're going to do some of that. I kind of want to start backwards, though, and start talking a little bit about what you're doing in Austin and what your kind of research focus is and what your interest is right now, just kind of where your head is at. Can you give us, this book originally came out hardcover in 2015.
Yeah.
And so in the past couple years, sort of how has it changed your research focus or where are you headed now?
So the research project that I'm currently working on, and of which my fellowship with the Ransom Center is part, is this project in which I want to try and investigate the let's say the intertextuality, the intertextual connections between Wallace's work and the let's say the existentialist literary canon. So my previous book was really about the connections between Wallace and philosophy, and a lot of it existentialist philosophy, but obviously there's also existentialist fiction. And I think everybody who's read something about Wallace knows about his admiration for Kafka, for Dostoevsky. And so the current project is really to try and test some ideas that I have about certain, I think, seminal texts within Wallace's corpus, how they could be read as actually being inspired by certain texts from that existentialist canon. So, for example, Kafka's Metamorphosis, Dostoevsky's Note from Underground, Camus' The Fall, which is mentioned several times in the Focal chapter in The Pale King. What are the connections of that story to Wallace's oeuvre? And finally, also Sartre's Nausea. So the next book project, the project I'm currently doing, and which is supposed to result in that book, it will be sort of a succession of these comparative readings. And I've been working on that, let's say, for roughly the past year. And what I've also been doing in the meantime, sort of since the book came out, is that I've also tried to work on the connection between the things I found in my readings of Wallace, how they might apply to better understanding certain developments in contemporary cinema. So we all know these terms like new sincerity,
which you deal with a lot in this book,
which I try to deal with in the Existentialist Engagement book. And that term is also being used in cinema, but quite similar to what I found in Wallace studies and literature studies, is that term remains underdefined, I feel. What do we mean by sincerity? And what do we mean by sincerity when we talk about cinema? This seems to be a weird term when you want to talk about cinema, and I've tried to clarify that a little bit and try to see how some of the suggestions within the existing debate can be tied together by coming to some more, let's say, philosophically underpinned understanding of that concept.
When new sincerity is used to describe filmmakers, I mean, I find it to be all over the place, and that it seems almost a matter of taste.
Yeah.
And that the people, if you like Wallace, you usually like these kind of filmmakers. And, we see some of those same names come up all the time. Charlie Kaufman,
Wes Anderson.
Spike Jones, Wes Anderson. Noah Baumbach.
Thomas Anderson sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's just like, to me, that seems like what you're saying is very ill-defined, and same with music, too. There's a lot of musicians that are called, they're in the New Sincerity movement.
Yeah.
And it's very, it makes it seem like a fad.
Yeah.
Almost like this is something that comes and goes.
Yeah.
Do you think it's more defined in literature or in some other film?
I think the term new sincerity by now is a little bit more defined in literature. I think it's not the go-to term for a lot of people in film studies, because sincerity is, I think, an even weirder term for people in film studies. What does it mean for a film to be sincere? And people feel they're somehow put off by it. But I do think that it ties in with a lot of these discussions in literature, in film, in art in general, sort of this desire for realism, for a new form of realism. I mean, there are all kinds of footnotes and little nuances that we should make, but I do think that there are interesting connections in talking about somebody like, for example, Charlie Kaufman, as being somehow driven by the desire to portray something, to say something meaningful about reality in the form that he chooses to do so, and the way that Wallace chooses to do so. They are very clearly not straightforward realists, but what would it mean to be realist in, let's say, our current artistic cultural time frame? And what I've tried to do is in relation to film, try to build on the work of a couple of film philosophers who've also tried to revitalize our understanding of André Bazin's notion of realism, who's usually interpreted as a supporter of very straightforward ontological realism, right? Film is realist because of its automatic photographic aesthetic, and if you use long takes you use a lot of wide shots and you can see all the characters and you have depth of field, then you have realism. But I think that's not at the core of what Bazin proposes. For him, realism is films that allow for a belief in a meaningful reality. That film somehow offers a meaningful expression of reality and speaks to what it means to be alive. Now, obviously, I'm using these terms because I'm also, into Wallace.
Right.
So that might be the reason why. Yeah, that might be the reason why it sounds very Wallace-like. But I think that's not the best explanation here. I think there's an affinity between what is happening, in film studies and in literature studies in these films. And indeed, I think it does include Anderson and Kaufman, but I think it also includes less usual suspects, like, for example, Lars von Trier, Michael Haneke, Richard Linklater, those kinds of filmmakers. The Dardenne brothers, I think the Dardenne brothers are an amazing example of how their style is, on the one hand, very self-aware and very, as a spectator to their films, you become very aware of the presence of the camera, and their films are very intense to follow, but at the same time they're almost documentary-like in their intense realism. And I think those developments, those sensibilities in contemporary cinema have a clear kinship with the writing of people like Wallace.
So it sounds like your new project has a lot in common, maybe even as an extension of your previous work, because there is that focus on existential philosophy, and Camus is in there, and Sartre is in there. But your definition of sincerity in the book, or the kind of forcing the reader to define sincerity, or really push you to give a basic definition of sincerity. I found that whole discussion in your book very interesting, because you bring it back to something about stability. Can you talk about that? Like, what does stability have to do with sincerity in this context that you bring up in the book?
Well, I think the starting point for me was to somehow engage with a lot of these discussions about how sincerity is supposedly an outmoded virtue, and how when people say of Wallace or Eggers or whichever writer, when the label sincerity is used, that is equated with naivete and with somehow some sort of naturalness, and the assumption that I have some sort of true self which is naturally expressed, that would be sincerity. I try to question that is simply, I think, not the way that we use the word sincerity. I think when we look at virtues of self-becoming, maybe for the past, say, roughly 200 years, a lot of the literature suggests the dominating virtue in Western culture has in fact been authenticity. Somehow to be true to some sort of a core of what you are or supposed to be, and to somehow resist corrupting external influences.
Yeah, kind of like transcendentalist ideas like Emerson and Thoreau, like the sense of your self identity is the core.
Yeah. But you could even
locus of truth.
But you could
right?
even see, let's just call it broadly, the postmodernist project as also being motivated by that. This postmodernist project of somehow revealing the self to be an illusion that is merely conditioned and structured by external forces, that has as its premise that by somehow becoming aware of that, by becoming aware that the self that has been created through the course of your life, that is merely a fiction, a series of masks, that this insight in itself would somehow be liberating and more authentic than believing that you are the self that you have been becoming throughout those years as the result of education, advertising, or whatever. So what I try to add to this is say the notion of sincerity doesn't necessarily have to bring with it the assumption of some sort of inner self which is honestly communicated to the outside. I think in many ways that is actually more what authenticity brings with it, right? In order to be authentic, I have to have something inside me which is somehow protected from outside corruption. And when I'm trying to be sincere with people, I'm simply trying to cohere and to get back to your question, Matt, to somehow make stable my expressions in the world and the actions that come with it. That if I attempt to be sincere, it is the attempt to somehow create some sort of coherence between my actions, between my promises, between my ambitions,
consistency,
and some that I also look back to who I have been so far, and that if I feel that some of those things are not so good, that I undertake actions in order to change that, and that I am actively involved in this process of self-shaping. So I think the existential call to the individual to form a self, to become a self, to integrate somehow the different projects in one's life in some sort of coherent self, that for me very well qualifies for this label of sincerity. And again, not as being some sort of naivete and some sort of honest communication of what I have inside of me, but some sort of attempt to create a coherent self that has a certain presence in the world and takes responsibility for his or her relations to the world and to other people.
God, you bring up something in the book too that a lot of Wallace scholars, when they're having this discussion, which you do with the AA portions in the book, especially with Don Gately and his attempts to become a sort of coherent self through this system of AA. But when talking about sincerity, you also bring up a bit from Octet, which I really love. And there's some discussion in there. There's some great lines about defining sincerity is really not even like something even beyond what you would typically imagine, that it's almost defenseless, that it's beyond defenseless. It's like unarmed.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of, maybe this goes back to the film as well, is that we define it in terms of what it's not. You're unarmed, you're pure of heart in a way that's I don't know, that it's lacking something that I'm really curious. Maybe we should back up and say how the book is structured a little bit.
Yeah. So can I just briefly respond to that? I think for me what a notion like sincerity communicates is that myself depends on the outside and it depends on other people. When you think about already all the associations that you could have with the word authenticity, the word authenticity is about me, me being authentic. When you think about the word sincerity, it is about how I relate to the rest of the world. And I think indeed, with sincerity and with the attempt to be, a self as the existential tradition calls us to be, that indeed it includes this element that we also see in Octet. This acceptance of being, in some ways, unarmed before the other. My attempt to be a self in the world is, in some ways, I have to surrender myself to the others in order to form this self and to have this self sort of acknowledged, to use a Cavelian term. Yeah, sorry. But,
but that's perfect because, I authenticity is another ball of wax that I've thought about a lot, and this is a sort of random example. But when I lived in New York, for example, there's a big self-reflexivity, a big self-feeling of like, are you a real New Yorker? Are you an authentic New Yorker? And it's like, well, what makes you an authentic New Yorker?
Yeah.
And really, it comes down to what you just said, which is you get to decide. You choose. If you choose to act and live It doesn't matter if you've lived there for a week or 20 years or 50 years or your whole life. Is like, if you choose to live in such a way, you're authentic.
Yeah.
And the same with like fans of certain things. We deal a lot with like fandom, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, am I a real fan or am I someone who just got on the boat today?
Yeah.
And it's like, in a way, it doesn't matter. That you get to decide the way that you define yourself and you choose to act. That is what makes something authentic or not. And there's, more elegant ways of putting this, and that's why when you were talking about that kind of hyper-reflexivity, that it's something outside of yourself, that made me back up and think we need to maybe give an outline of the whole book here, because you start out really talking about that hyper-reflexivity problem, and to me that sort of sets up a lot of this tension between the self and the world, right? And that there's tons of good quotes in here that about if you want to stop being egotistic and solipsistic, then you have to have something outside of yourself to. Can you say it better than I am? I'm like floundering.
Yeah, well, I guess, and also the reason why the connection that you're suggesting is indeed so strong, also in the book, is because the hyper-reflexivity and the sincerity chapters are both in conversation with Sartre.
Right.
And I think what Sartre's early existentialist phenomenological philosophy helps us see very clearly, and I think it's also really that part of Sartre's philosophy that Wallace is so interested in, is that early part of his philosophy is really about trying to define what consciousness is and how consciousness relates to the world outside it and relates to others, or maybe actually phrased better, how consciousness is that relation to the outside world and to others. There is nothing beyond consciousness except this relation to the outside, and Sartre makes this division of what he calls degrees of consciousness, and he talks about pre-reflective consciousness as a being with the world. I'm simply, I'm walking, and all my attention, all my consciousness, so to say, is directed towards the world. As soon as I start thinking about what I experience, I get on the reflective level, and I thematize, in a sense, my experience. And there, Sartre says, implicitly the I, the ego, arises. And what then happens at the next level, the self-reflective level, is that consciousness thematizes that I, that ego, the consciousness itself, and it becomes sort of wrapped into itself. And there are obviously all kinds of very useful aspects of that, but Sartre also immediately notices how that is, in a sense, consciousness moving away from what is its object, namely what is beyond consciousness. And if consciousness turns in on itself, it in a sense forgets about that world, and it forgets about the other people that are, supposedly what it's in contact with. And this can turn into what you could call hyperreflexivity, what we obviously see a lot in Wallace's work, where consciousness is only interested in itself, and it is completely turned into itself, and it doesn't have the objects that it is consciousness of anymore. It simply becomes this turned into itself thing that objectifies itself. And maybe I didn't explain this so clearly. Maybe
you did.
Maybe people should read the book. For Sartre, when I said consciousness is nothing except that relationship to the world, for Sartre that means that consciousness is not an object. It has no thing-like quality. It is a relation to things. It's a relation to objects. It's a relation to other people. But when consciousness turns into itself, it starts treating itself as if it is an object. It starts treating itself on the model of the way that it looks at the world outside. It starts treating itself as stones and other objects in the world, and you start objectifying your own mental states as somehow objects that are inside yourself, which Sartre says is not what consciousness is like. That is not an accurate representation of what the contents of the mental life
that's
are.
That's a problem.
Yeah, and it leads to these objectifications of thoughts. And all the things that can go wrong about that, of which Wallace is such a fantastic cataloger in a sense. Yeah.
And I realize we've got to this far in the conversation without once mentioning Dave Eggers or Jonathan Safran Foer. So maybe we should also say, not only do you deal with Sartre and Camus and Wittgenstein and Kierkegaard. But also with a few novels, not the entire oeuvre, but a few novels from Dave Eggers and from Jonathan Safran Foer. Do you want to tell us why you picked those particular ones?
Yeah. Well, first of all, what I really wanted to do is not make this a book about one author. I really also wanted to engage. Earlier, we talked about a certain lack of a definition of sincerity. Mm-hmm. I think very similarly, I found that the debate about Wallace's work and authors that might be seen as following his example or something like that it was missing some sort of investigation of what it might be that ties their works together then. I mean, I think there's a lot of differences between Wallace on the one hand and Eggers and Foer on the other, and also just between the three of them. But I think there are also good reasons for saying that they also have some affinities. And I wanted to research that, and I wanted to somehow describe how we could look at those novels, at the works of those novelists as being related. And my approach to that was to say they have a certain shared philosophical dimension. Some of the concepts that are part of that we've already mentioned: hyper-reflexivity, sincerity, but also irony, a certain desire for reality, commitment, for community. And I think I chose Eggers and Foer because I think at that point, when I was starting this project, they were clearly being marked in a lot of articles as the clearest examples. I think for a lot of people, they were also the authors through which people came to Wallace. I mean, that was the case for me, right? I read Eggers first. I mean, Wallace wasn't so well known in the Netherlands. I read Eggers, I read his first book, and then I heard about this. I was reading
Wallace
about Eggers.
Blurb it. Did he have his quote?
The hardcover. Yeah. So I thought, hey.
Yeah, I also read Eggers and Foer before coming to Wallace as well.
And I think, as I also say in the book, Wallace is in many ways the sort of the difficult writer who pioneered, I think, some of these philosophical aspects of the writing that connects these authors. And maybe Foer and Eggers, they clearly are in a sense indebted to Wallace. And maybe their works are not as difficult and not as witness to complex, they also they don't feel as if they've been the result of the same struggle that Wallace clearly had in giving shape to his fiction, finding exactly what he wanted to say in those works. But I still think that there's kinships between these authors, and that's what I wanted to somehow bring together in the book.
It's interesting for me because my perspective on some of that was the result of a lot of publishing hype. And, like living in New York and working in publishing, very attuned to like what is the next big thing. Yeah. And what do a lot of people say is like the next great literature, right? And at the time, I was very into Wallace and thought that Infinite Jest had sort of been left out of all the major awards and been snubbed a few years before. And when Eggers' book came out, I was like, this is shit compared to Wallace. But I still read it and enjoyed it, but I was like, I'm very...
But by comparison, it's
like,
just there's no contest.
If you found gold, everything is compared to that. And so for me, I think that's an issue with, and we've talked about this with Wallace listserv, for example. It was a spin-off of the Pynchon listserv, and a lot of people who are Thomas Pynchon fans or readers, they're always looking, because they have 10 years between a novel. They're always looking for what is who is compared to him. Who's compared to him, and that's a constant thing that not a lot of writers compete with. I don't think a lot of people say, who is the next, I don't know, Jennifer Egan, and people are like, I really can't wait for someone to be compared to. Maybe I'm picking on her unfairly, but just as an example, I think Franzen's in the same boat. I don't think many people think, oh, I really love Franzen, who else should I read? He just doesn't have the same kind of following.
No one thinks that.
No, no, and I think that sort of there is a lot of natural tendency to group writers together, and to look at people born about the same time. The publications are the most guilty of it. I think the New Yorker famously had that picture of Wallace with Eugenides and George Saunders, Junot Diaz, and sort of Zadie Smith, Rick Moody, people kind of born around the same time. So it's really rare to see someone dig into the actual work and look at the novels themselves and say, how is Dave Eggers a new sincerity writer? Specifically.
How thematically and formally could you say that there is affinity between what could be said to be, the philosophical theme and formal aspect of sincerity in Wallace's work and in Eggers' work? And I'm quite sure that some people, might take a very a different look on how these works relate. But I think what I try to offer in the book is a coherent way of trying to talk about these authors together, also without ignoring the fact that they're also very different. In the introduction, I try to introduce it as saying, acknowledging that these novels are different language games, but they're language games with that have resemblances, family resemblances between them. And I'm not sort of imposing one monolithic interpretive framework on them, but I'm trying to trace these philosophical connections. And I think in the end that is a helpful thing to do, and it gives us a better idea of why there might be some good reasons to actually compare these authors, and why those authors were compared in the first place. Besides, obviously, also a lot of hype, a lot of okay, it's probably very helpful if we pitch Eggers as the new Wallace that's going to sell books. But it also worked the other way around. Like I said, in turn, it resulted in a lot of people finding Wallace who had not found Wallace yet by reading Eggers. So it works both ways, and I think that's pretty valuable, and also philosophically interesting to still see, how do they connect.
Oh, and and it's hard for me to talk about this without sounding like a complete sycophant. But it's true, and I also don't want to equivocate and just say, oh, everyone is the same, they're all good. I think the way that I read your book was that Wallace sort of dominates a lot of the scene of American literature that a lot of people, especially at a certain time, were trying to emulate. And Saunders had that line after Wallace died about how he was the first among us. But back to your book, in the sincerity part, then you go into this part about reality and commitment. And I really liked that part of your book because I like anything that gets what I think to the heart of the matter of why Wallace wrote Infinite Jest. And there is a sort of recipe for living in there. And it's no doubt a lot of... Because there's a criticism of Wallace, too, that's like, oh, he kind of paints this dystopian world but doesn't really offer a way out. And I think that he does, and it's through AA. Yeah. And a lot of that is set up in your book to talk about community, not specifically about Wallace, but like you've got this part about, the trap of reality and then the way out being community.
Yeah.
Can you say that better than I did? Because I don't feel like that's 100%.
I'll try. Yeah. I'll try, and please steer me in the right direction if you feel I'm going somewhere where you didn't intend us to go. No, I mean the reality commitment chapter is also, maybe I should mention that in a similar way as the hyperreflexivity chapter and the sincerity chapter are in conversation with each other, so are the irony chapter and the reality commitment chapter, and both are these the novels of these authors in conversation with Kierkegaard. Yeah. And Kierkegaard has given an irony critique that I think is very illuminating in relation to Wallace's irony critique, and I think the same holds for indeed trying to understand how Wallace is offering some sort of alternative to that irony critique, without just saying we shouldn't use irony or whatever. It's about the impact on the self if you do not somehow escape sort of an endless a type of irony that in the end completely empties out the self. This goes back to what we discussed earlier about this trying to somehow become a coherent self. Kierkegaard uses the terms gift and task for that. He says, on the one hand, you are gifted this existence, and at any point in your life you have a part of that existence behind you. And this is what you have been given, and that you somehow need to deal with, and that you need to take responsibility for, even though it's behind you and there's stuff in it that you can't undo. But that relates to your task, namely that you also have existence ahead of you, and you need to somehow make those two parts cohere, and take responsibility for what you do, for what you choose. And this is a vital term in Kierkegaard, and I think also in Wallace. This idea, the necessity of choosing, the necessity of commitment, and realizing that this not choosing, that is irony, which is in many ways the avoidance of choice, is in the end detrimental to the self. And I think, I mean, there's something to say for the fact that in Infinite Jest, there's also a lot of, you could say maybe, hedging about how seriously should we take AA as an alternative. I mean, there's enough remarks in the novel for maybe skeptical people to say, well, but actually, there's also a lot of making fun of AA and people in AA. But I think that doesn't then notice other elements in the novel where, the alternatives and sort of the situation of these addicts, this, the situation of people like characters like Hal, and this beautiful passage about anhedonia and this rootedness in romantic Weltschmerz, and that choice is necessary, and that AA is to be taken seriously as a possible route to this. And I think why sort of the making fun of AA is in the novel is to tempt the reader to see this as a way out, to say, AA is also, that's not serious. How can you take this serious, right? We live in an ironic age. This can't be a serious alternative. And therefore, I think what is important about Wallace's fiction, and what I'm also realizing in this new research project, is that so many sort of, I think the real substance to Wallace's, what you could call ethical project, is actually supposed to be realized in the reader while reading. So we can think that, Mario might not be a convincing character, or that Gately, in the end, might also be a too simple portrayal of sincerity or virtue. I personally don't think so, but I'm aware that some people might think so.
Bret Easton Ellis, I'm sure does.
Huh? Bret Easton Ellis. Yeah, undoubtedly. Yeah. So, but I think in the end, what is important is what these things cause in the reader, and the kinds of let's say, philosophizing, the types of realizing, okay, what is this novel trying to tell me? How is it trying to let me look at reality? Which kind of questions is it asking me, to pose in relation to that reality? And that is where these notions of sincerity and attention, other directed attention, right, where they are probably most properly realized. Sorry, I went off on a little bit of one of those digressions that I fear.
No, that's actually right on track with what I was asking, and I think that AA discussion is something that definitely reads differently to me after Wallace's suicide, and that yes, I do think he took it seriously, and it mattered a lot to him. And to him to write about it, he could sort of only do it that way. But that was, by his own admission, like the thing that saved his life. And it's not someone who grew up with this idea of a higher power, not someone who, you would think, went to Harvard for philosophy. He was in the midst of, he was not your typical AA candidate. But and I don't think that there's something didactic about this so much of him trying to say everyone should do this. It's more like, here's one report from the beyond. But the fact that you, engage so much with that storyline and take it seriously as a sort of philosophical construct, to me, that's part of the reason why people come back to the book, is that feels so real and authentic. And yes, it does work in the book, but also as it relates to something beyond. It's not just like, oh, you wrote a novel about 9/11, or you wrote a novel about traveling around the world. It's like, no, you wrote something that, changed your life.
Yeah, and I think no reader of Infinite Jest can deny that those AA sections are,
some of the best.
They are some of the best in the book.
Yeah.
And you can't say that and on the other hand say, but they're not serious somehow.
No, and I that's an interesting criticism, because I think it might have a little bit to do with the way that you deal with boredom in the book, and that you say, like, it's not so much that it's not serious, it's like, oh, it's boring. And just like the people in AA, when they're first introduced to these kind of banal cliches, it's like, that's boring, or that's, could you talk about that, the way that you see the boredom issue working? A lot of people think only he deals with that in The Pale King, but there's a lot in Infinite Jest. Would you say that? Yeah. How does boredom fit in there?
Well, can I tie it to Kierkegaard?
Please do. Please do.
Yeah. That might make the most sense, or at least the easiest for me. No, for Kierkegaard, boredom is the thing that the ironist fears most. When irony, in a sense, serves the ironist to distract from all kinds of things that might ask for that person's commitment or sustained attention. And a lot of things, when given sustained attention, might indeed, lose their initial allure or whatever. And what Kierkegaard is, he wrote beautifully about boredom, that it is, in a sense, the ethical task to take this upon you, to accept boredom and to see boredom as your continuing confrontation with what you choose. That if you're serious about something, if you want to give your life direction, if you're going to want to give coherence to yourself, you have to be involved in a sustained way with those choices, and you have to accept the duration that comes with it. If you're going to be in a relationship that that will sometimes make you feel the passing of time. There will be moments where it's not exciting and jazzy and great and whatever. There are going to be moments of boredom, and Kierkegaard tries to say that, but it's exactly these moments of boredom that you have to work through and that confront you with the importance of your choice. And I think what Wallace shows, especially I think in Infinite Jest, he shows the huge difficulty that a lot of people have with enduring boredom. It's the main response of all these addicts in AA, as you said, right? This is boring. This is simplistic. How am I supposed to listen to all these people? Just talk about how their lives went to shit, and I'm not like them. My life is different, and I just have to listen to these whiny people
I don't even believe in it.
Yeah. And then at the end we're all supposed to pray to a higher power. And that's magically going to cure me. And how does that do justice to my great intelligence, right? That's also that idea that these things are boring because they're somehow simple, and I am not simple. I'm sophisticated. I'm an intelligent, hyper-reflexive human being who is constantly aware of the flip sides of everything. And now you're giving me this thing that you're telling me has no flip side, is just what it is, and I should just take it for what it is. I think the response of those addicts in Infinite Jest is it's this automatic response, right, that they have to ironize it in order to get away from that, the boredom of it, the simplicity of it. And for Kierkegaard, that's very much what he calls an aesthetic response, the response to let everything in life somehow be exciting, be somehow in conformity with some sort of ideal that person has about living, and that ideal tends to be about pleasure, and that can be very refined intellectual pleasure. It can be maybe more base carnal pleasure, but in whatever way, it's in pursuit of this thing of what these people think that supposedly life should be about. And Kierkegaard says this is an aesthetic desire, and in boredom lies actually the ethical call to become a self, to not constantly chase these these little nuggets of pleasure that you might gather here and there, but to somehow give shape to your life and accept the boredom that somehow belongs to it, that you have to accept in order to somehow make yourself coherent. I'm not sure. Did I explain that in any way that makes sense?
And that's where we rely on you to make these connections to Kierkegaard. And I'm certainly not well read and near as much of the literature as you are. And that's why I want to ask you about one. Before I forget, I did have another question for you about the chapter on Wallace and Wittgenstein, and how you think that Wallace was in conversation with Wittgenstein, and in what way?
Ooh, that's a big question.
That's a big question.
Where to start? Well, I mean, in many ways, there are so many declarations in his writing that he was a fan of Wittgenstein, that he was convinced by what Wittgenstein wrote.
All right, let me be a little more specific.
Okay.
Let's say that Broom of the System, let's not talk about, because that to me is not his greatest work, and it's very overtly about Wittgenstein.
Yes.
Let's say between Wittgenstein's two major works, Tractatus and Philosophical Investigations, how do you see Wallace engaging with that after Broom of the System? Or even if you want to bring up some of Wittgenstein's minor works, that would be great too.
Well, I mean, I think it's there's an interesting similarity in the sense that Wallace comes from this pretty hardcore sort of logic,
analytical
philosophy background, which I think has many of its roots in early Wittgenstein. So the Tractatus Wittgenstein. And I think what you see in Wallace's work is a way to somehow, well, maybe that sounds as if he's mapping it on Wittgenstein. That's not what I mean.
He's moving in a similar direction.
But that he's trying to find a way to write fiction that somehow enables the readers to interrogate reality and that doesn't somehow declare this is the philosophical system with which to understand the whole world, which is what Wittgenstein in a sense does in the Tractatus. And he says, the purpose of language is to describe the world out there, and every word that doesn't mirror the state of affairs in the world, or every proposition that doesn't do so, that lacks sense, and we should not speak of that. And that, of course, he means not literally. He says, well, that actually encompasses all the most important things in life, ethics and religion and whatever, love. But then he has this development towards the philosophical investigations where he says, well, but this was a very specific way of looking at language. This is only a very small part of the possible functions of language. And he starts treating language as based on, how does it function in certain context. And I think what for me is very important about the later Wittgenstein is the way that that later work, or the way that we read the investigations. When you read it, it's not a book that you can paraphrase. It's not a book that you can say, well, this is what it's about, and this is its structure. It's very much a book that you have to read, that you have to experience, and you have to be in the conversation with Wittgenstein. He's constantly asking these questions and bringing up these situations. And I think this Wallace made very clear that the view of language expressed there appealed to him. That was an eye-opener after the views of language that he'd been exposed to before. And I think that the way his fiction works is very similar. Like I tried to say a couple of minutes ago about where I think the virtues that Wallace's fiction might be seen to describe or advocate, that they are actually most prominently realized in the reader. It's because of, I think, this almost Wittgensteinian process of reading Wallace, that you're in conversation with the text. The text is not, I think almost everything that Wallace wrote, there's not this clear one thing that you need to get from it. The stories are not, this is the narrative content that you need to take in. They're supposed to somehow trigger you to ask questions about the characters, about the world they live in, how they relate to your world, and that's the exact same thing that Wittgenstein does. And I think in terms of how he views language, what is important for Wallace is that he sidesteps, that sounds maybe a little bit cowardly, and that is exactly not what he does, but he declares, I think, what you could call the traditional picture of language, and by extension, although this is after Wittgenstein officially, but also certain postmodern critiques of the traditional view, he in a sense declares them as irrelevant. He says all these discussions about how words somehow get their meaning from either these concepts that are in some sort of Platonic eternal heaven, or there are these eternal timeless truths that give meaning to our words, or if we're less platonically or less religiously inspired, we might say, well, but my words are given meaning because of the thoughts in my head while I speak them, or my words are given meaning because I say bottle and I point to a bottle in the world, and the bottle in the world gives meaning to my words about that bottle. And what Wittgenstein says is that sounds like a very convincing picture. We might think that is how language works, but that is not in fact how language works. My words do not get their meaning from my thoughts or from the objects in the world that they're supposedly referring to, but from our practices in using language. And it's these uses and these contexts that provide these words with their meaning. And the interesting thing is that this thereby, and I think this allows Wallace to overcome that sort of postmodernist Derridean problem, where there's this constant questioning of the connection between words and reality. And I think a lot of his, let's say, rewriting and his sort of what you could call maybe his critique of John Barth is modeled on this problem. A lot of metafiction is about pointing out the illusory character of fiction, right? The words in the fiction don't point to any, actual realities. It's all, structure. It's all fake. It's all fiction. And the invitation in postmodernist philosophy and postmodernist literature is that we somehow see how this extends to our normal use of language, right? That everything is a linguistic construct, and that words somehow always fail to make that connection to the world. That our attempts to describe the world are always just that, attempts to describe the world. They never actually succeed in doing so. And that's why you find in Derrida a lot of things like, words fail to mean. And this, in many ways, that creates a huge problem, because, if we're always failing to describe the world in some meaningful way, why are we doing this? What are we supposed to do? And Wittgenstein, in a sense, says words are not failing to do anything. They're not even attempting to make that connection to the bottle in the world. That's not how it functions. It functions, the reason why the word bottle has meaning is because, we have this language community in which we know what we mean when we refer to bottle. And there's 99 of language use situations where there's no unclarity about what I mean when I say to you, can you get me a bottle of something from the fridge? And Wittgenstein says that is the basis of how language functions. And obviously there are situations in which language is more complicated and more ambiguous, and one of the places where that is the case is in literature. And Wittgenstein says that is one of the reasons why literature is so interesting and so important, because reading literature explicitly brings with it the question of how are we supposed to think these words? And is the novel somehow involved in, investigating how we mean, how our words mean, how we understand the world? And I think that for Wallace was a very important aspect of Wittgenstein's philosophy, and seeing it connected to his philosophical, his literary philosophical project, I would say. Sorry, that was another long digression.
No, that's great, and it leads to more questions from me. Dave, did you have more questions for Allard?
Of course, yeah, absolutely. So we've covered several of the main philosophers that you talk about in your book. Maybe to step back a little bit and talk about your process in this book. One thing that comes up several times is that you got to interview all three of the authors, Eggers, Foer, and Wallace. And I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of sort of background and insight as to how those interviews developed, what your impressions of these three writers were as people, maybe on a personal level, how they informed your argument in this book in ways maybe that wouldn't have occurred before.
No, I think it definitely was very helpful. This was very much in the formative stage of the project. So it was really at the start of my PhD, and in the end, this book that got published that came out of the dissertation that I wrote. To describe the process, I sent letters. I sent all three of them letters. I had Wallace's address at his university. I sent a letter to Eggers at McSweeney's, and I knew some people at Foer's Dutch publishing house. And Foer has sort of a special connection with his Dutch publishing house, because actually they're now divorced, but Nicole Krauss and Jonathan Safran, they met, I think, in Amsterdam. Or at least they were both there on invitation of the Dutch publisher. And that is, why I think the publisher had sort of a good connection with them. And they gave me they gave me an address, which I then later found out was simply his personal home.
So the short answer is you stalked these guys.
Yeah.
Through some indirect channels.
More or less, yeah. I think I was somehow reluctant to use that word.
No.
Please commit a crime.
No.
Yeah.
So
please commit a crime.
That's interesting.
Goodness gracious.
Not a lot of writers, especially our scholars writing now, have that sort of background where they, especially with Wallace, that they corresponded with him. What was that like? Did he take 6 months to respond and then apologize for it and not really answer your questions?
Yeah, well, no, not at all. The first thing, I am one of the lucky recipients of a Wallace postcard.
Nice.
I wrote him this letter briefly explaining the project, And I think relatively quickly, I think within a month, I got a postcard saying, this sounds interesting, but I'm realizing more and more how little I know about my own writing. Not sure if I can be, of help, but feel free to write more. I'd love to hear more about your project. So I wrote a more extensive description of the project, and I got a letter back, which was incredibly generous in the attention that it paid to my project. And he was especially interested in the things I wanted to do with Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein, and he responded specifically to those parts. And I think based on that also that triggered his interest. And he said this might be more efficient if we do this via email. And then we emailed back and forth a bit, but that was also the point where he said, just list the questions that you have for me, because I tried to convince him to let me interview him in person, but I got the response that almost everybody got, saying, I will start sweating profusely, and I get uncomfortable, and I'm worried that you might take my words out of context, and when I write them down, I have control over what's there. And so that forced me into that situation where you have to list your questions. And I tried to resist the temptation to be funny about it, and to hedge and whatever. I just said, okay, these are the questions I have in mind. I can give you all kinds of running commentary, but this is what I would like to talk about if we were to meet in person. You're free to interpret the questions as you want, but it did mean that I asked these really broad, overly straightforward questions, which he then, of course, his answers were mostly unpacking the question and sort of and picking it apart and saying things like, well, with this question you might mean this, but that means that you're setting me up to say that and that, and doing those kinds of things, which was also incredibly valuable because in some ways I was asking him impossible things. And I think what I learned from that was also very much, okay, you're interviewing somebody, what are your expectations? What is this person going to be able to tell you? And I think if I'd gotten another chance interviewing him, I would have definitely done it differently. But it still was very interesting, and it was very interesting to see his mind work in those responses. They were very elaborate. They remained very friendly, but at the same time also very, he was clearly very, very conscious about rigorous, but also very conscious of, okay, you're researching my fiction, you're asking me these questions, and you'll make connections between what I will say now and what you read in my fiction. So he was constantly giving me disclaimers about how what he was saying actually had any relevance for his writing process and for how he thinks about his own writing.
Please tell me you printed all this out.
It's
we'll put it in the show notes.
It's archived it somewhere.
Yeah, no, it's backed up both physically and digitally.
Okay, good.
Yeah. There was this one annoying thing, however. Somehow I don't know a lot about email programs and whatever, but there was some sort of I think something that didn't really connect between the ways that we sent our emails, and both our sentences kept cutting off. So there were sometimes parts of sentences were missing,
trimmed.
So that was a bit weird, and
redacted.
No, well, not redacted,
just
because
cut off.
Yeah, cut off. Yeah, ablated was the word.
Tree of codes.
Yeah, no, he and that annoyed him, and that annoyed me. It also gave the conversation something mysterious, because there might be these little truths and these insights that were missing from the conversation. But yeah, that was a conversation with Wallace, and I learned a lot from it. I was very grateful that he was willing to respond at all. And the same holds for the other two guys. I went to San Francisco to interview Eggers. And
cool.
And I took this picture in the introduction.
The
sidewalk.
The
sidewalk
in San Francisco, very close to the McSweeney's office, and I arrived at 1. That was what we'd agreed, and he saw me coming in, and he said, "Hey, you're the Dutch guy. Weren't we supposed to meet at 3?" And I said, no, at 1, but I can leave. And he said, no, I have a bit of time now, but I have another meeting at 2, and that might be too short. And, long story short, I ended up staying almost the whole day there, and also, sitting in on a couple of conversations that he had with other people. And most of our one-on-one conversations took place in the basement, where they also had sort of all the stock of the McSweeney's.
The pirate store?
No, the pirate store.
Or below the pirate store?
The pirate store was across the street. But it was, shelves full of books. And he just said, help yourself.
Take something.
Yeah, take something, but also,
nice.
it will take me some time to finish up this next meeting. Go read, I'll be right back. And I think in the end, I talked to him for, over these different sessions, more than 3 hours. And he was incredibly generous with his time, cool. And really nice guy to interview. And Foer, the funny thing was, Foer was the first to respond via email, and he said, sure, let's set this up. But then, he didn't respond to proposals for specific dates. It turned out later that he was actually in Italy with his wife, and that he wasn't there for, the most of the period that I was actually in New York. So when I was approaching, my departure date, I thought, okay, I have this address.
Go.
I will just go there, and it will probably be his agent's office or whatever, and I can say, hey, I have 4 more days in New York. Can I please meet with Foer? And it was somewhere in Brooklyn, and I walked down this street, and I thought, this looks pretty residential. Mm-hmm. And I knocked on his door, and for a long time it was silent in the house, and then I suddenly I saw somebody coming down from the stairs. In a box of shorts and his socks, and it was Foer, and they arrived from Italy the night before, so I guess he was
super jet
lagged, and he said no, sure, we have to make this happen. Are you okay with Monday, which was 2 or 3 days later? And I said, that's the day before I leave, so that's great. And we had lunch at this cafe, sort of at the corner of the street, and I think I also talked for 1.5, 2 hours to him. So they were all incredibly generous with their
cool.
time.
Wow!
And it was incredibly helpful for my
Amazing.
Project. Also to realize the limits of what you can expect an author to say about their own work. I think that was something that I needed to learn at that point, and they still gave me a lot of helpful information also to develop the project, to know, okay, this is the direction that I should be taking it in. So in many ways the project was very strongly influenced by those interviews.
Very cool. I wanted to ask this like 45 minutes ago when it was relevant. This is a more philosophical question, but we've talked. So 3 keywords have been New York, Charlie Kaufman, and hyperreflexivity earlier in the conversation, and I wanted to tie those 3 together and maybe talk about Synecdoche, New York, a little bit by Charlie Kaufman, and how you might see correlations to some of the work and themes in Wallace. Because one of the things that we said we would talk about is we'd spend some time talking about film specifically. So I wrote a paper on Synecdoche, New York back in years and years ago. But I just like when you were talking about the ideas of Jean-Paul Sartre and selfhood and identity, that movie does some really interesting things with those concepts. And I wonder if you would be able to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's actually some time ago that I saw that film, so I find it a bit hard to come up with something eloquent to say about that film. Besides that I completely agree with you, and that it's for me obvious that film engages with exactly those philosophical themes that we
totally.
It's very depressing.
Yeah, that also.
It's very depressing.
Yeah,
I mean, I didn't love it the first time I saw that film just because I thought it was so bleak.
Yeah,
and just sad, and I was like, and it was long, and I was like, I don't know if I want.
Yeah, it's almost 3 hours.
Live in this world much longer.
Which version though, Matt? There's like 100 versions of this world.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
It's too recursive.
One response to your question would be we should do a podcast part 2 and just talk about film.
Yeah.
If I can just take the liberty of not really responding to your question and tying it in with
Absolutely,
Anomalisa,
man.
which is
Kaufman's
Kaufman's
newest film,
more recent film. I mean, I think that film is so interesting in how it deals with those themes of realism that we talked about at the start of the conversation, right? When we talked about trying to make this connection between Wallace's literary project and what might be going on in contemporary film. I think what for me is so interesting about Anomalisa is how it's I think is a great example of how some of these contemporary films combine awareness and immersion, I would say, right? That on the one hand, it is a film that is incredibly self-conscious and forces the viewer to be very self-conscious in relation to the film, to be constantly aware of the fact that you're watching puppets, that you're watching this fake constructed world, also by making the seams between those faceplates visible, but at the same time that it's such an incredibly human film, and that there's this interesting dynamic between constantly being aware of looking at puppets, but at the same time feeling that these are the most human characters that you might have seen in film for a very long time, and also to have a very human response to them. I mean, one of the things that's stood out to me is how uncomfortable the love scene made me and a lot of other people in the theater. And I know Zadie Smith wrote a great essay about that film, and also about her. About her, and it's an essay about a couple of sort of digital animation films. It also includes the Polar Express film. But she talks about her experience sitting in the theater and watching that scene with the rest of the the spectators, seeing this pretty explicit oral sex between puppets. And that there was this sort of nervous giggling of people in the audience, and what strikes me about that is in many ways that is a response that we've somehow been conditioned not to have anymore when we see love making in live action movies, right? We've been conditioned to think, well, this is normal. I'm here in this dimly lit bedroom with these two characters taking each other's clothes off, and I'm just sort of this spectator, and I'm completely comfortable with my spectatorial position. And Anomalisa actually brings back a certain uncomfortableness with my spectatorial position. Why am I watching this? Why am I witness to the intimacy between these two characters? Especially because this intimacy seems to be something that both these characters crave incredibly. That one of the characters has, apparently missed out on for a very long time already. He doesn't even see other people as full individuals. And now finally he encounters somebody, and they have this click and whatever. And that, to me, that you watch that scene, and on the one hand you're thinking, I'm watching puppet sex, and on the other hand you think, this is.
It's like Team America.
Yeah. But on the other hand, it's sort of really realistic and endearing lovemaking, and I think that is it's just an example of how that film works for me, and how I sort of think that combination of awareness and immersion, how the fact that you're not being pushed out of the film by this incredible self-consciousness, but that actually that self-consciousness is being used to pull you into the narrative, that is something pretty remarkable about that film, and that I think connects it to some other contemporary films and some other Kaufman films, but also connects it to the Wallace literary project. I mean, for me, the interesting sort of partner example would be a film like Boyhood, which you would think is more or less the opposite, right? It seems like a naturalist film. It's filmed in this very naturalist style.
Yeah.
You have actors aging instead of somehow being make-upped to look like they're a couple of years older. So in that sense, it has this naturalist feel to it. But at the same time, this is so weird for us to see actors actually age on screen. It inevitably gets you thinking about the film as film. But then you also start realizing how, you're given these slice of life events and you're with these characters for almost, 2.5, 3 hours. And there's this combination of being very aware of the film as an artistic venture and all the, the logistics that it brought with it. But at the same time that you're being shown this very real and human portrayal of this boy growing up. And for me, in that sense, Anomalisa and Boyhood are almost sort of these congenial cinematic experiments. One with puppets and seemingly artificial, and one shot over 12 years and seemingly naturalist. But both creating this effect of simultaneous awareness and immersion. And the reason why I'm interested in that is that a lot of these discussions about what is called postmodernism or metamodernism, or all these terms in relation to cinema, is that there's always talk about tension between irony and sincerity, tension between self-consciousness and immersion, oscillation, unsuccessful negotiation, those kinds of terms. And when I watch these films, I don't feel that it's unsuccessful. I don't feel there's a tension. I feel there's a productive conjunction of them, and I feel that they work together to create this effect. I feel that the awareness and the immersion make this a cinematic experience that I don't have with films from 50 years ago, and that maybe makes them so essentially different from what we would call maybe classic realist movies from let's say the 50s, and that there's a new type of realism or a new type of sincerity to these films that has interesting affinities with Wallace's writing.
Oh, that's interesting.
Cool.
I think I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I want to.
Me too.
I think that too.
I have a lot. I guess I have a lot of more questions for you, and I could go on. But I want to mainly thank you for being on the episode, and thank you for writing this book. I want everyone to go out and buy it. I'm holding it up. You can't see it on the audio version. But
we're actually using video phony
up,
for once. We almost never do.
Existential Engagement in Wallace. I really think it's one of the best books in Wallace studies that I've read.
Thank you.
And
it's
I
great.
underlined a lot more questions that I have for you, and especially
Yeah,
your stuff about film and media is really relevant. And we didn't even talk about the fact of the filmmaker is one of the main characters of Infinite Jest.
No, yeah.
So is there anything else that we didn't mention? Any final thoughts you have that you want to say before we sign off?
Well, no. First of all, it's great to hear that that you appreciate the book. I mean, I've spent a lot of time writing this, and now to have it actually being read in the world by real people, that's fantastic. So that's thank you for that compliment. Well, I could also go on for a very long time, and I shouldn't. I think one of the things that I'm super excited about is the new project that I'm working on, and all the things that I'm finding in the archive. And I think to make a sort of a small connection to what we discussed earlier. I mean, I mentioned my feeling that the most important effect of Wallace's fiction is in the reader. I'm working on this comparative reading of Camus' The Fall and Wallace's Good Old Neon. And I think one of the dilemmas when reading these texts is, how to deal, in Good Old Neon, for example, with Neil's struggle with, the fraudulence trap, so to say. And it's so interesting to see how Camus lets his main character in The Fall, Clémence, sort of set up the same type of structure, where we work towards the end of the story, and at the end of the story it's revealed that the narrator is actually in some sort of way manipulating the character or the interlocutor or the addressee, whatever you want to call it. And we have, of course, that turn at the end of Good Old Neon. And I think what's so great about the comparison between these stories is that, it tells us something about, how we read. And I think when we read both those texts, we are obsessed with somehow finding out, okay, what is wrong? What is exactly, how can this character somehow be so, in this problem? And he has to be so extreme that he can't find his way out. And Robert Solomon has a beautiful text about Camus' The Fall, saying that is somehow the readerly strategy that we should resist, that we should, in a sense, say, there is nothing wrong with Neil, and that's not what Solomon says, because Solomon talks about Clémence in Camus' book. But I think you can extend this very helpfully, that there is nothing wrong, and that we should not be focused on somehow finding, okay, what is the core problem here? What is the explanation for why this character is this way? But accept that it's, in a way, his confrontation with absurdity. And that the problem with Camusian absurdity is that when you realize the contingency of all truth, is that after that it's not just that there are no truths anymore, but all truths feel like they're fraudulent, and you feel like you're a fraud. And Solomon says we should therefore resist sort of falling into that trap and somehow agreeing with Neil that he is a fraud, and realizing how we are, in a sense, subject to the same dynamic, and in a sense reading against Neil's ongoing self-accusation, and at that final twist in the story also David Wallace's ongoing self-accusation, and somehow trying to break that spiral of hyper-reflexivity, which again is such an important topic in both those texts. And that is why also the ending of the story, not another word, in a sense of this ongoing, self-accusation, and maybe also as readers this ongoing desire to find, okay, what explains this guy's problem, but that we somehow accept that this whole fraudulence is a result of the absurdity with which the individual is inevitably confronted, and that therefore this mode of attention has to be realized by the reader, and that we therefore somehow have to give the characters in that story the attention in which somehow the ethical call of that story is realized. Sorry, this was a very digressive, long-winded, and non-purposeful final thought. I hope the better version of this will end up in the book that is to come from all this, and in the sort of upcoming 2-3 years at conferences, I hope.
For sure.
Yeah, good.
But we're going to edit it down. No.
That's probably the right
20
thing to do.
25 minutes tops. Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
So
Allard, you have another month in the archive,
yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, so you're getting some serious research time in there.
Yeah, no.
I'm very excited to see what comes out of all that.
Yeah, so am I.
In your future work.
You're gonna have a long time to sort through all your photographs when you're done. It's gonna take a while.
No, definitely. Yeah, no. I mean, right now, just going through different Infinite Jest drafts, there's so much to take in, and to catalog for yourself, right? To capture and to catalog. And this will, this is material for years of research.
It is true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Do you guys ever foresee a time where they might publish the unpublished scenes of Infinite Jest?
No.
Does that seem like, from a publishing standpoint, like that's something that like people would buy or be interested in at all? No.
They're also, I mean,
just like too small an audience to make it work.
Maybe. I also don't think that there's much. There's much demand outside of us. Like, there's a small group of like Wallace people
outside of like the 1,000 people who listen to this podcast.
Well, I think there's sort of like, I don't know. It's like rubbernecking. Like, you're gonna slow down and look at it, but I don't know what kind of scholarly value it has. You can already access that by going to the Ransom Center if you're a scholar, and just reading like a director's cut of Infinite Jest. What if it's not as good?
But you also meant these sort of those early unpublished stories, right? So the beautifully titled Enema Bandit story.
There's another one, the Enema Bandit. That one. There's one called the Piano and the Pantechnicon.
Yeah, but that officially has been published.
Has it?
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh, yeah?
the earlier stuff beyond Enema Bandit is pretty juvenile.
Yeah.
Like, it's pretty... he's trying to just get laughs.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Right.
The Enema Bandit is, in many ways, quite funny.
It's
juvenile.
funny.
But
It's a Frank Zappa song. I mean, there's a Frank Zappa song, The Enema Bandit of Peoria, Illinois. Or whatever.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the Ransom Center hasn't really published anything by Wallace.
Yeah.
I don't know if they would allow like a big project. I'm sure that in a way they don't want to, because then if everything was published, it's like, why would you go to the Ransom Center?
I think in terms of really publishing them, I think there's also the dilemma of, really trying to squeeze the last little bit out of, the Wallace corpus by publishing this.
Right.
I do think, it's nice to be able to read them. I find it interesting. I found it, exciting to read it, but it's also I don't think it's the stuff that people will go to Wallace for, or are missing out on enormously by it not being publicly available.
No, but that squeezing the last little drop is true of like every major writer.
Yeah.
I think that's not unique to Wallace. I think that's true of like Faulkner and Hemingway and Virginia Woolf. Like if they found a letter or a previously unpublished story, hell yeah, they would publish it. Somewhere would publish it.
Right.
Yeah. So that I think a lot of writers' juvenilia gets published. I think maybe more of it will be published at some point.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some other little minor stories like Other Math. I don't know if that was ever published anywhere else.
Don't recall.
Anyways.
Yeah.
We could go on.
Cool.
Right?
Yes, we always could go on for more and more hours easily. But Allard, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's lovely to have you like in the studio, which is a rare treat, especially for Matt here.
Thanks for
hang out in real life.
And if people want to read more of your work, where else can they find it besides this book?
Yeah, exactly. Well, they can hear a lot about it on the podcast now. Yeah, maybe by popular demand, we should do a part 2 so we can pick up on all the things we didn't get to discuss.
You don't really do Twitter or social media or anything?
No, I'm really bad with that.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe it's also...
Do you have an academia.edu
No, not even that.
page
I do have a website which I intend to update pretty soon.
Do you have a phone? No.
I do have a phone. No, but what I do intend to do is update my website, in the nearby future, also to make what are officially called author versions of my published articles available, so that people can just get them instead of having to go through some sort of Springer paywall or whatever.
Yeah, it's allardendulk.nl.
.nl. Yeah.
Right. And we'll definitely link to that from our website. And
yes, we'll put you in the show notes. You're also published in Gesturing Toward Reality, David Foster Wallace and Philosophy, with your Good Faith and Sincerity article, as well as the Paris Conference publication from 3 years ago. Any other places that
there's the
that are easily accessible?
There's the Boswell collection.
Long thing.
That features my boredom essay. Most of those essays are actually the same ones as appeared in the studies in the novel special issues. Mm-hmm. But in my case, I published the article on irony in Studies in the Novel and an article on boredom in the Long Thing collection. So that's worthwhile for people to know. There's the presence of the other.
So this is all really good. Dave, if people want to find us, where can they find our work?
We are on Twitter at Concavity Show, same with Instagram, and if you want to get in touch by email, we are concavityshow@gmail.com. Hear me now, I insist. Oh, you've gotta trust me when I say long for something better than this.
All right.
That's a wrap. Sounds good.
I think that was longer than an hour.
All right.
Yeah.
I think you're right.
That's not too bad. It's not our longest.
It's always how it goes.